January 31st, 2026. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announces a 2-day live-fire naval exercise across the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow stretch of water that carries roughly 20% of the entire world's oil supply. On the surface, it looked routine, the kind of muscle flexing Iran had pulled dozens of times before. Central Command issued a direct warning beforehand that it would not tolerate unsafe actions from the IRGC, specifically citing concerns about low altitude or armed overflight of American vessels operating in the area. The United States had just deployed the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln into the region days earlier. Iran's Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi, told reporters the same week that Tehran remained open to what he called fair and just negotiations, but flatly rejected any demands touching Iran's missile systems or broader defense strategy, saying those would never be up for discussion. 2 weeks later, on February 16th, Iran did it again, temporarily shutting down parts of the strait for a second live fire drill, this time while its own negotiators were sitting across the table from American officials in Geneva for another round of indirect nuclear talks. It was the first time in the entire history of the standoff that Iran had formally announced a closure of the waterway rather than simply running exercises around it. Iran's IRGC Navy commander said something during that drill that, in hindsight, reads less like a routine statement and a lot more like a warning nobody outside Tehran was fully listening to. He said the weapon that reaches the battlefield on the day of war is different from what gets shown during a drill. 12 days after that quote went out over Iranian state media, the actual war began, and it began with nearly 900 strikes landing across Iran in a single 12-hour window. Sit with that timeline for a second, because it's the entire spine of this story. 2 live fire drills, 6 weeks apart, each one dismissed in real time as fairly standard Iranian posturing. A direct, on-the-record quote from Iran's own naval leadership warning that whatever the world was watching during those exercises represented only a preview of what real conflict would actually look like. And then, less than 2 weeks later, the single deadliest and most consequential opening wave of strikes the Middle East had seen since the invasion of Iraq more than 2 decades earlier. Most people watching the news in late January and early February had no reason to connect those dots in real time. Looking back at it now, with the benefit of knowing exactly how the following weeks played out, the pattern is impossible to miss. Let's slow down and actually walk through what these live fire drills were and why they mattered so much more than most casual observers gave them credit for at the time. Iran has run naval exercises in the Strait of Hormuz for decades. It's practically a national pastime for the IRGC, a way of reminding the rest of the world exactly how much leverage sits inside that narrow waterway without actually having to fire a shot at anybody. But the drills at the end of January carried a different weight because of the timing. They came directly on the heels of the United States, sending a full carrier strike group into the region, and they came packaged with warnings from Washington about overflight and unsafe maneuvers that suggested both sides were already treating this specific round of exercises as something closer to a live rehearsal than a symbolic gesture. Iranian state media described the operation in almost bureaucratic language, framing it as naval shootings spread across 2 consecutive days, complete with formal navigational warnings issued to commercial shipping companies operating in the corridor. That's not how you announce a purely symbolic show of force. That's how you announce something you expect commercial shipping to actually plan around, and shipping companies did exactly that, reassessing routes, timelines, and insurance premiums almost immediately. Here's the piece of the story that deserves way more attention than it got in the moment. Iran wasn't just running drills to intimidate anybody watching from outside. Analysts covering the region at the time pointed out that this entire approach fit a very specific and very deliberate playbook, using tactical pressure inside a narrow maritime corridor to generate real economic costs, without ever having to cross the threshold into open conflict. Every time Iran ran live ammunition through that strait, global shipping had to react, insurance markets had to reprice risk, and oil traders had to factor in the possibility that this time the drill might not stay a drill. That's an incredibly efficient form of leverage. You don't need to sink a single ship to move oil prices and rattle international confidence. You just need to remind everybody, on a semi-regular basis, that you technically could. Think about the economics involved for a second, because it puts the strategy into sharper focus. Roughly 20 to 30% of global daily oil consumption transits through that single waterway, more than 20 million barrels on an average day, according to shipping industry figures cited around the time of these drills. There is genuinely no alternative route available for the volume of traffic that moves through the strait, a point shipping officials made explicitly at the time, meaning any disruption, real or threatened, forces the entire global energy market to price and risk, with essentially no substitute corridor to fall back on. That's precisely the leverage Iran has spent decades cultivating around this specific stretch of water, and it's exactly why a 2-day live fire drill involving a relatively modest number of vessels and missiles can move markets and dominate headlines around the planet in a way that a similar exercise Almost anywhere else in the world simply couldn't. Let's fast forward to the second round of drills in the middle of February, because this is where the story genuinely starts to feel less like posturing and more like foreshadowing. Iran announced it would temporarily close parts of the Strait of Hormuz specifically to conduct what it called a smart control exercise, closing sections of the waterway for a few hours at a time to observe what Iranian state media described as safety and navigation principles. On its face, that sounds almost cooperative, like Iran was simply managing traffic responsibly around its own military exercise. But experts tracking the region immediately flagged how significant the framing actually was. According to an Iran specialist at Israel's Institute for National Security Studies, the last time Iran had actually closed the Strait of Hormuz was during its war with Iraq back in the 1980s, when Iranian forces mined the waterway outright. Every drill since then had been exactly that, a drill, running around the edges of the strait without ever formally declaring a closure. This announcement broke that pattern for the first time in decades. The same analyst described it plainly as a message to the international community, a way of signaling that any strike on Iran would carry consequences that rippled across the entire global economy, not just across Iran's own borders. And here's the detail that really should have set off alarm bells at the time, even though in the moment it got treated as a fairly standard piece of military bravado. The commander of the IRGC Navy, addressing the drill directly, told Iranian media that the weapon actually used on the day of real war would be different from whatever equipment got shown off during the exercise. Think about what that statement is actually doing. It's not a threat exactly, and it's not quite a promise either. It's something closer to a warning label, an acknowledgement straight from Iran's own naval leadership, that everything the world was watching during these live fire drills, all those cameras capturing missile launches and naval maneuvers, represented only a fraction of what Iran was actually capable of deploying once a real conflict started. That's a genuinely unusual thing to say out loud during a training exercise, and it deserves a lot more scrutiny in hindsight than it got when it was first reported. Now here's the part of the story where the contrast becomes almost impossible to ignore. While Iranian naval forces were literally firing live ammunition through one of the most sensitive waterways on the planet, Iran's own diplomatic delegation was sitting in Geneva engaged in indirect nuclear talks with the United States. According to reporting at the time, the Iranian delegation told American officials they would present more detailed proposals within the next 2 weeks, specifically aimed at narrowing the gaps between the two sides. And in one of the more telling little footnotes buried inside the coverage of that week, oil prices actually fell once the talks concluded, suggesting that, at least in the immediate moment, markets read the diplomatic track as the dominant signal rather than the live fire drills happening in parallel. That's an important thing to sit with, because it tells you the world genuinely believed, right up until the very end of February, that negotiation was the primary track, and the drills were simply theater running alongside it. 12 days later, that assumption turned out to be catastrophically wrong. Let's talk about what actually happened on February 28th, because the scale of it is genuinely difficult to overstate even now, months removed from it. In the first 12 hours of that day, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated wave of strikes against Iran totaling nearly 900 separate hits. 900 strikes in half a day. The operation carried 3 different code names, depending on which country's military you were asking. Operation Epic Fury for the United States, Operation Roaring Lion for Israel, and Iran's own retaliatory campaign that followed got named Operation True Promise 4. The strikes targeted Iranian missile systems, air defense networks, military infrastructure spread across the entire country, and critically, the country's senior leadership directly. Israeli intelligence, working alongside targeting information from the American Central Intelligence Agency, had assembled a picture detailed enough to locate and kill Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, along with dozens of other senior officials in that same opening wave. Iran's defense minister was killed. A senior Revolutionary Guard commander was killed. Within the following days, additional senior officials, including Ali Larijani, who had effectively been running the country's crackdown on internal protests since January, were also eliminated. By any measure, this was one of the most successful and most sweeping decapitation operations executed against a sovereign nation's leadership structure in modern military history. To put that scale in perspective, this conflict has been widely described by analysts and historians covering the region as the largest single military confrontation in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And the opening 12 hours alone accounted for a strike tempo that most modern militaries would consider an entire extended campaign rather than a single day's operation. The lead up to that moment had been building for years, tracing back to Iran's nuclear program, its ballistic missile stockpiles, its extensive support network for regional proxy groups including Hezbollah and Hamas, and the collapse of earlier diplomatic frameworks going all the way back to the original nuclear deal years before. Domestically, Iran had also just come through its most widespread wave of protests in decades at the start of that same year, Protests the government crushed with lethal force, adding an additional layer of internal instability to a regime that was about to lose dozens of its most senior officials within a single afternoon. Iran's government didn't confirm Khamenei's death publicly until March 1st, a full day after the strikes, which itself tells you something about the chaos and confusion gripping Tehran's command structure in those opening hours. Iran's president at the time, Masoud Pezeshkian, released a statement through state media describing Khamenei's killing as having come, in his words, at the hands of the most wicked villains in the world, and framing Iran's coming retaliation as both a legitimate right and a solemn duty. He went further, describing the assassination as effectively a declaration of open war against Muslims broadly, and specifically against Shiite Muslims around the globe. That kind of rhetoric wasn't just domestic messaging aimed at rallying a shocked population. It was setting the stage for exactly the kind of expansive, multi-front retaliation that followed over the coming days and weeks. Here's where the human cost of that opening wave becomes impossible to separate from the broader military story. Among the strikes carried out during those initial 12 hours, one specifically hit an elementary school located adjacent to a naval base near the city of Manab, close to Bandar Abbas. Reports on the death toll from that single strike varied, with some accounts putting the number of children killed at over 100 and other reporting placing the combined toll closer to 170 people. Regardless of which specific figure ends up being the most accurate once the fog clears, the fact remains that one of the most devastating single incidents of the entire opening operation was a strike that hit children rather than a legitimate, hardened military target. And that single event became a rallying point for Iranian retaliation and international condemnation that shaped the emotional temperature of the entire war going forward. President Trump, addressing the strikes publicly, described Iran's supreme leader being killed as crossing what one Iranian official characterized to reporters as a very dangerous red line, though it's worth noting that framing came from the Iranian side rather than from Washington itself. Trump indicated the strikes would continue through the following week, and, in a move that dramatically escalated the stated goals of the entire operation, publicly called for regime change inside Iran, encouraging ordinary Iranians to rise up and seize control of their own government. According to assessments from foreign policy trackers covering the conflict, the stated American war goals extended well beyond simply neutralizing the immediate missile threat. They included destroying Iran's ballistic missile capabilities entirely, eliminating its navy as a functioning fighting force, permanently preventing Iran from ever acquiring a nuclear weapon, and severing the country's support network for regional proxy groups. Iran's retaliation, once it came, arrived on essentially every front simultaneously. Missile and drone strikes went out against American embassies, military installations, and oil infrastructure spread across the wider Middle East, hitting targets throughout the region rather than staying confined to a single retaliatory strike against Israel. And critically, for the specific story we're tracing here, Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz to all foreign shipping. Not the temporary, few-hour closures from the live-fire drills weeks earlier. A full closure, transmitted directly to vessels transiting the strait over VHF radio with the blunt instruction that no ship would be allowed to pass. By March 2nd, the IRGC had formalized that position even further, officially confirming the strait was closed specifically to what Iranian officials termed unfriendly nations, while still technically allowing vessels that Iran itself approved to continue moving through. Britain's Royal Navy responded by noting publicly that Iran's declared closure carried no actual legal standing under international maritime law, though it acknowledged that safety for any vessel attempting the transit could no longer be guaranteed, which was more than enough to convince a large number of shipping companies to simply keep their vessels in port or turn them back entirely rather than test the claim. So look at the full arc of what just happened here, laid out end to end. Iran spends January and February running live-fire drills, each one slightly more dramatic than the last, each one paired with rhetoric that, viewed individually, could reasonably be dismissed as routine saber-rattling from a regime that's used exactly this playbook for decades. And then, less than 2 weeks after the second and more dramatic of those two drills, complete with an on-the-record warning from Iran's own naval commander that real wartime weapons would look nothing like what the drills had shown, the actual war arrives, and it arrives with a scale and a speed that caught much of the world flat-footed despite every one of those warning signs sitting in plain sight in the preceding weeks. Let's also acknowledge the sheer difficulty of the judgment call facing anyone watching this unfold in real time, because hindsight makes all of this look far more obvious than it genuinely was in the moment. Governments run military exercises constantly all around the world every single week, and the overwhelming majority of them never precede an actual war. Treating every naval drill as an imminent invasion warning would be its own kind of analytical failure, one that would leave policymakers and markets in a permanent state of false alarm, unable to distinguish real signal from the ordinary background noise of a tense but stable standoff. The genuine skill in reading a situation like this isn't simply reacting to every drill as though it's the final warning. It's weighing the specific details, the unprecedented nature of an actual declared closure, the unusually direct language from a senior naval commander, the tightening timeline between escalating signals against the broader baseline of normal posturing. That's a genuinely hard analytical task. And the fact that so many experienced regional analysts still lean toward the diplomatic track holding right up until February 28th tells you just how difficult that balance actually is to strike correctly, even for people whose entire job is reading exactly these kinds of signals. Let's talk about why that gap between warning and recognition happened, because it's genuinely one of the more important lessons buried inside this entire timeline. Part of it comes down to something psychologists and intelligence analysts both refer to as warning fatigue. When a country runs the same basic threat display over and over again across years without it escalating into actual conflict, each subsequent version of that threat display gets treated with a little less urgency than the one before it. Iran had run live fire drills through the Strait of Hormuz, more times than anyone bothered counting over the preceding decade. Every single time, the world watched, oil prices twitched, and then life continued normally once the exercise wrapped up. That repetition builds a kind of institutional numbness, a background assumption that this specific signal, however dramatic it looks on the surface, simply doesn't carry the weight it theoretically should. And that numbness is exactly what makes an actual escalation, when it finally does arrive, land with so much more shock than it probably should have, given how clearly some of the warning signs had actually been laid out in advance. There's an analogy worth using here because it captures the dynamic pretty well. Think about a smoke detector that goes off every single time somebody makes toast in the kitchen. After the fifth or sixth false alarm, most people stop jumping up from the couch. They just wait for the beeping to stop on its own. That's a perfectly rational response to a pattern of repeated false positives. Right up until the one morning, the beeping means something completely different. And by the time anybody actually gets up to check, the fire's already spread well past the kitchen. Iran's live fire drills had functioned as exactly that kind of recurring smoke detector for years, going off regularly enough that the world had developed a rational, evidence-based habit of not treating each individual instance as an emergency. The tragedy of this particular sequence is that the habit that had served as a reasonable heuristic for years turned out to be exactly wrong at the one moment it mattered most. There's also the simple fact that diplomacy was actively happening in parallel, and diplomacy tends to dominate the public narrative in ways that military posturing simply doesn't. When Iranian negotiators are sitting in Geneva promising more detailed proposals within 2 weeks. That's the story that gets the headline, that's the story markets react to, and the live fire drills running in the background get filed under routine tension rather than genuine warning signs. It's an understandable read of the situation in the moment, but it's also exactly the kind of read that misses the deeper reality, that a regime can be pursuing negotiation and preparing for war simultaneously, using each track to buy time and cover for the other, right up until the moment one of those tracks simply wins out. Let's get into the aftermath and what happened across the following months, because the story didn't end with those opening 900 strikes. It was really just the opening chapter of a conflict that kept evolving for the rest of the year. Iran's assembly of experts, the clerical body responsible for selecting a new supreme leader, moved quickly to appoint Khamenei's own son, Mojtaba Khamenei, as his successor, while an interim leadership council was simultaneously stood up to manage the immediate chaos of losing dozens of senior officials in a single day. That succession happened astonishingly fast for an institution that had spent decades preparing for a transition that everyone assumed would come from natural causes rather than a coordinated airstrike. The speed of that handoff tells you the regime had, at minimum, some contingency planning in place for exactly this kind of decapitation scenario, even if the actual scale of what hit them clearly exceeded whatever they'd specifically rehearsed for. It's worth pausing on just how unusual that succession genuinely was in the broader context of Iran's political system. The Assembly of Experts is not a body designed to move quickly under normal circumstances. It's a deliberative clerical institution built around consensus and religious authority, not rapid crisis response. Handing leadership directly to Khamenei's own son within days of his father's assassination, rather than opening a longer, more contested selection process, suggests the surviving leadership structure prioritized stability and continuity above almost everything else in that moment, even at the cost of skipping over whatever internal debate might normally have accompanied a transition of that magnitude. That decision alone tells you how close to genuine institutional collapse the regime believed itself to be sitting in those first chaotic days after February 28th. From there, the broader campaign to actually reopen the Strait of Hormuz, the waterway Iran had shut down in direct retaliation for the opening strikes, became its own extended military operation running for months. Beginning March 19th, the United States launched a sustained aerial campaign specifically aimed at reopening that waterway, targeting Iranian naval vessels and drones that had been positioned to enforce Iran's own closure. By April 13th, that campaign had evolved into a formal naval blockade of Iran itself, flipping the entire dynamic on its head. Iran had tried to close the strait to punish the world, and within weeks, the world's response was to blockade Iran's own coastline instead. In early May, a brief operation referred to as Project Freedom produced a short, temporary halt in the fighting. Though as anyone following this conflict closely already knows, that pause turned out to be exactly that, temporary, with strikes resuming and escalating again in the months that followed through the summer. Here's the honesty check worth sitting with, as we zoom back out to the original thread of this story. Iran's live fire drills in January and February weren't some kind of secret hidden signal that only a handful of insiders could have decoded in advance. The warnings were genuinely public, genuinely on the record, and genuinely specific. A naval commander, stating plainly that real wartime weapons differ from what gets shown in a drill, isn't subtle language. An unprecedented, formally announced closure of the Strait of Hormuz for the first time since the 1980s isn't a minor procedural footnote. Those were real, verifiable signals sitting in the open record for anyone paying close attention. And yet, the dominant narrative in the days immediately preceding February 28th was still centered on Geneva, on narrowing gaps, on the possibility that negotiation might actually hold. That's not a criticism of any single analyst or news outlet who read it that way in the moment. It's simply an honest acknowledgement of how genuinely difficult it is to separate real warning signs from routine noise, until after the fact makes the distinction obvious. Let's think about what this specific sequence teaches us about how to actually read this kind of escalation pattern going forward. Because Iran has continued running exactly the same playbook well past February, using naval drills, strait closures, and calibrated rhetoric as tools of leverage throughout the rest of the year's fighting. Every single time Iran has escalated its posture in the Strait of Hormuz since that initial war began, whether through a fresh round of drills, a renewed threat to close the waterway, or an actual attack on commercial shipping, the same basic pattern has repeated itself. A period of buildup and warning, often dismissed in the moment as routine posturing, followed by an escalation that, viewed with hindsight, was signaled well in advance by people who were actually paying attention. That's not a coincidence, and it's not unique to Iran either. It's simply how state actors with limited conventional options tend to communicate intent through calibrated displays of force that ratchet up incrementally until either the other side blinks or the display itself crosses over into the real thing. There's a broader lesson here about the strait itself too, because everything that's happened across this entire year traces back to the same underlying geography. The Strait of Hormuz remains, by a wide margin, the single most consequential piece of water on the planet in terms of pure economic leverage. Roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil moves through that corridor on a normal day. And every single actor in this conflict, Iran, the United States, Israel, the Gulf states sitting along its shores, understands exactly how much power comes from being able to credibly threaten disruption to that flow, even for a few hours at a time. That's precisely why Iran kept reaching for exactly this lever throughout the opening months of 2026. First through drills, then through an actual declared closure once real war broke out, and it's exactly why every subsequent attempt to use that same leverage across the following months triggered increasingly severe and increasingly fast military responses from the American side, each one specifically designed to make sure the particular card stopped working as effectively as it once did. There's also a pattern here worth remembering the next time any country runs a drill that looks, on the surface, like routine posturing. Naval exercises, missile tests, formally announced waterway closures. None of these things exist purely for training purposes. They also function as communication, a way for a government to signal capability and intent to an audience watching from thousands of miles away without having to say anything explicit through a formal diplomatic channel. Iran's live fire drills in January and February were never purely about training its own sailors. They were a message, delivered twice, in increasingly specific language, to anyone paying close enough attention to actually decode it. The genuinely uncomfortable part of this particular case is that the message got sent clearly, on the record, twice, and it still wasn't enough to meaningfully change how the following 2 weeks played out for the millions of people across the region whose lives were upended the moment the actual fighting began. Let's close out by connecting all of this back to where things actually stand today, because the pattern that started with 2 seemingly routine live fire drills in January and February hasn't really stopped playing out. It simply kept evolving in scale and intensity across the rest of the year. The naval blockade that began in April has been reinstated multiple times since, each time following a fresh Iranian provocation. The strait itself has been threatened with closure again on more than one occasion, in the months since the original war began. And Iran's own naval forces, the same ones that ran those confident live-fire exercises back in January, have watched significant portions of their coastal infrastructure, their submarine repair capability, and their fast attack boat fleet get systematically dismantled across a sustained campaign that traces its entire origin back to that single catastrophic 12-hour window on February 28th. Whatever confidence Iran's naval commanders projected during those drills, whatever implicit promise sat behind that warning about wartime weapons differing from training equipment, the actual war that followed has spent the better part of a year proving just how much of that display genuinely was theater, and just how much of Iran's real naval capability has been ground down piece by piece in the months since. I want to know what you think about how predictable all of this actually looks in hindsight. Do you think the warning signs sitting inside those 2 live-fire drills were genuinely there to be read in real time? Or is this exactly the kind of pattern that only looks obvious once you already know how the story ends? Drop your thoughts down in the comments, because there's a real debate worth having about how much weight routine military posturing should actually carry versus how much of it genuinely is just noise until the moment it isn't. If this breakdown helped connect some dots you hadn't seen lined up quite this clearly before, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps put detailed timelines like this one in front of more people trying to actually understand how this entire conflict got started, rather than just remembering the headline from the day the war broke out. And if you want to keep following how this story keeps developing, because it clearly hasn't stopped evolving since February, go ahead and subscribe, because there's a lot more of this timeline still left to unpack. Thanks so much for watching all the way through, and I'll see you in the next one.